Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for many of you who are joining us once again. Welcome back. My name is Haley with CMI, and I'm here to provide your intros, as has been our routine of late. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Haley Ross. I work for CMI, or the Columbia Mountains Institute of Applied Ecology, and I'm joined here today by Kendall Benesh and Marcy Marr with the Kootenay Conservation Program. And we have, of course, joined forces again this year for what has been the 9th season of CMI's CRED Talks, or the Columbia Region Ecological Discussions, and KCP's 11th Winter Webinar Series. Before we get going, I'd just like to pause and make sure that we acknowledge the region in which both of our organizations work, which is the unceded homeland of the Sinixt, the Secwepemc, the Ktunaxa, and the Syilx Okanagan peoples, who have stewarded and cared for this land, water, and wildlife since time immemorial. And as we've been doing, I want to give you an opportunity to provide your own acknowledgement. So if you open up the chat, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, please feel welcome to let us know whose Indigenous territory you're zooming in from today. And if you'd like to add what your affiliation or what your related work is that has inspired your interest in today's webinar, we'd love to read that as well. All right, so I'm going to move on. I'm just going to introduce the series and what we've been doing. So we've been exploring the theme of stewarding for biodiversity. We've welcomed 4 speakers who are discussing this theme from different perspectives, emphasizing that conserving biological diversity and caring for all living things requires a variety of people, viewpoints, and practices. This year's series is financially supported by Ecoscape Environmental Consultants, and LGL Limited, as well as KCP's core program funders. Our 4th and final webinar series is today, and we'll be welcoming Jonaki Bhattacharyya, I did it, of Elemental Stewardship Consulting, to learn more about how stewardship works when small Indigenous-led teams take a relational approach rather than a prescriptive one. Jonaki will walk us through boots-on-the-ground examples of Indigenous protected and conservation areas establishment, cultural burning, wildlife monitoring, and wildlife monitoring from BC's southern interior. And she'll take notes of nuances and lessons learned along the way. So I'll introduce Jonaki in more detail in just a moment. And while I have you, of course, I'm going to tell you a little bit, just briefly, about CMI, what we do, and who we are, as those acknowledgements continue to roll in. Thanks for participating in that. So CMI is a nonprofit organization, and we work as an association for people working in applied ecology. We primarily provide professional development opportunities in the form of conferences, courses, webinars, of course, that are addressing everything from field and data science research techniques to more complex land management conundrums. Our website is a great place to learn more about what we do. It contains talk recordings from all of our major events, including our webinars, and some fantastic proceeding documents and other resources. So you can find that at cmiae.org. And for now, I'm going to pass it over to Marcy Marr.
Thanks, Haley. Welcome, everyone. And as Haley said, I'm Marcy Marr, and I'm joining you on behalf of Kootenay Conservation Program. And we're a broad partnership of more than 85 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, First Nations, government agencies, agricultural producers, and educational institutions working throughout the East and West Kootenays and Southeast BC. The purpose of KCP's partnership is to cooperatively conserve the biological diversity and naturally functioning ecosystems of the region through land conservation and stewardship, and to generate the support and resources needed to advance this effort, which includes sharing technical knowledge and expertise through webinars like this. We're excited to be co-hosting this webinar series again with CMI, and we'd like to give an additional thanks to our program sponsors, without whom we'd not be able to provide opportunities for learning like this. Now, just a couple of housekeeping details and we'll get started. So this webinar is being recorded and will be posted within a week to both CMI's event webpage and KCP's Winter Webinar Series webpage. We'll have a Q&A at the end of Jonaki's presentation, so please use the Q&A function in the Zoom toolbar, not the chat. And add your question, and we'll do our best to make our way through them by 1 p.m. Pacific. Okay, back over to you, Haley. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So without further ado, we have the honor of introducing Jonaki Bhattacharya. Jonaki is an ethnoecologist who does applied stewardship in Indigenous-led initiatives. She combines experience and training in field ecology, wildlife management, cultural ethnography, research, and facilitation to do work that is rooted and driven by the communities. Jonaki's current work with the Chilcotin communities supports the Dasiko Newagualan, their Indigenous-led protected areas initiative, community mapping and stewardship, cultural burning, and wildlife monitoring. She also supported other First Nations and Indigenous guardian programs throughout Western Canada in their planning, stewardship, and restoration work. And when she can escape her desk, she prefers to be outdoors doing field work, walking in the forests, riding horses, or gazing wistfully at other people's dogs. We're really lucky to have her here. Jonaki, we're going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much, Haley. It's great to be here. I'm just going to move into a screen share so that we can get started on the chat. So bear with me for a moment. All right. Apologies, that seems to have been, let's just make sure. All right, good to go?
You're not in full screen mode yet. There we go.
We're good? Okay, thank you. Sorry for the delay. Thanks to everyone who's joining, and thanks to those of you who are organizing and inviting me for this. I wanted to talk today about my experience of supporting Indigenous-led community-based stewardship initiatives. Obviously, it's almost a little bit of a strange role for me. Most of the time, I'm in the background in a supporting role, and I can't speak for the communities for whom I work. Obviously, my job is 9 times out of 10 to promote and try to amplify and support those voices from those communities to be forward. And yet I think, I was invited to share my experience, and I think that there's hopefully some value in sharing occasionally for a couple of reasons. Partly, there's some really great work that these communities I work for are doing, and it's exciting to have the privilege of being involved and to be invited to speak about that and share about that. And also, I think there's value in those of us who are the backup band, playing supporting roles, sharing how we approach that and how those relationships evolve, because we're always trying to figure out how to do it better. And by that, I mean not only the methods and the technicalities that we're bringing to bear on these projects, but also how we approach collaboration, especially across cultures. And for that reason, I found it useful to draw on the term code switching, which I'll get to in a minute. So I wanted to begin actually with acknowledgements rather than waiting until the end. I'm really grateful to Columbia Mountain Institute for inviting me here to be part of this today, and I wanted to extend my thanks to the communities Hanikotin and Unisitin, especially, with whom I work, and the other organizations who support the work I'll be talking about today, which I'll get into in more depth, and a number of individuals who have been mentors, and also the photographers whose beautiful images I'll be sharing with you today. So code switching. I first heard about this term actually from Black voices from the US, talking about their experience of having to adapt how they speak and how they carry themselves in different settings culturally. And it resonated for me because my background, I'm mixed race, I'm Bengali on one side from India, and I'm also a mix of Irish, Scottish, and English on the other side. And I was born and raised here in BC. And so when I learned this term, it refers to the practice of changing language or dialect or speech styles depending on the situation or audience, and it can also refer to how we adjust the way we present ourselves, our behavior, our conduct, even our appearance in different contexts. And that just resonated for me because a lot of us who are mixed kind of grow up doing that inherently. And yet I think it really applies well to working in Indigenous-led stewardship work for a few reasons. I think, especially in BC, often when we're engaging in stewardship work, you have Indigenous and non-Indigenous people from various cultures in all of those realms coming together on the same land, nearby to where we all live. And usually we are speaking English to each other. And certainly for non-Indigenous people, it's easy to forget that we are actually working with different cultures, because we see the place that we're in as being at home. I think that I notice my Indigenous colleagues are constantly translating how they live, who they are, their relationship with the land into Western contexts. And so it's helpful for those of us in supporting roles to recognize that we actually are also need to meet people where they're at, and we're translating as well. So how does that play out in concrete terms? We can be speaking the same words when we're making a management plan for an Indigenous protected area, talking about respect and interconnectedness, and yet mean vastly different things by those. The depth of meaning or the way we think that plays out in a meeting room, in the process of governance decision making, those can be different. It can play out in how people express themselves. I was having a conversation with a colleague recently as we coached a grad student, literally just to stay quiet and listen more. Don't feel the need to take up some, to explain yourself. There's an awkwardness. I had a professor once reference it to like just squirmy, the way we feel squirmy in silence sometimes, and learning to listen. Code switching can influence how people, it can be a reflection of how people relate to place and to the world around us differently. We're often entering meetings with people who have very different experiences of dealing with institutions like government agencies, law enforcement, schools, and also who might have different priorities around group decision-making processes or outcomes. So a different way of defining success for a meeting. It might be more relational rather than did we achieve our objectives. So there's all sorts of ways, and we'll get into that. But I think that overall, I just find code switching a useful concept, a helpful framework to have these conversations. And that it's not about assigning value or saying one way is better than another, but it's useful to remind myself, I find, that I'm adapting to the context that I'm in a way that respects other people's way of doing things when I'm working. And so if I had to simplify it, I would just say, read the room, right? Like that's what we're all trying to do. The other way that it's going to come up in the 2 projects and programs I'm going to share with you is that I think these projects themselves are actually works of translation. They are active examples of Indigenous communities translating and having to code switch between just holding, like insisting on asserting space to be who they are in their own territory and practicing their own culture and stewardship. And it requires this constant translation into land use plans and management plans and economic development plans and government regulatory jurisdictional designations. And that is a form of code switching as well. So the two projects that I want to talk about are Dasiko Nehwago'an, this is Indigenous Protected Area Initiative, and the Yunasatin Quen Fire Stewardship Project. So Dasiko is an Indigenous Protected Area Initiative of two communities, primarily, Hanigotin and Yunasatin. It was born out of conflict, really. They were defending their territory against a lot of resource development pressure, and it was the same pressures that led to the Tsokotin title case. In 2014, they were, won the Supreme Court recognition of Title II, a fraction of their territory. And Dasiko sits adjacent to that. So it was declared on the heels of that 2014 title win as a way the communities could extend through additional parts of their territory a proactive vision for how they wanted to see their own future, instead of always being on the defensive and saying, no, not mining, no, not this, not that. They were saying, we already know how we want to live, so here's how. Just so you can get a bit of a locator, you can see where it is in the province there, and the map on the right shows how the communities really drew that boundary to marry up existing provincial protected areas and habitats to create some continuity across the landscape. And also those funny jagged lines on the top left there are actually because they pushed it up against the area for which they had title recognized. You can see these big lakes that's the Dasiko Lake's headwater system. It flows into the Fraser River. There's endangered salmon runs there. And these are really sometimes considered, people have referred to them as the lungs of the territory, these watersheds. So very important. The initiative was started by the two Tsokotin communities, so Yunasatin and Hanigotin, and this is really their shared overlapping areas of that they're responsible for caretaking within their territory. And they are two of 6 Tsokotin communities represented by the Chilcotin National Government. And so the national government helps when it comes to things like legal and negotiating. The meaning of the name, so Dasiko refers to those lakes and the rivers. And initially they termed it a tribal park and then dropped the English words altogether. And Nehwago'an translates to "it's there for us." So the name really speaks about what it is they're trying to protect, which is the relationship with the land. And this has always been an Indigenous-led process. It's the two communities that lead it. They're champions from within those communities. Decisions are taken through quarterly governance meetings attended by chief and council for both communities. And there's a small core team of us who provide sort of technical support as needed and have done. I've been involved in this initiative since its inception. Primarily management planning, but also supporting research initiatives. And these days, more and more as needed, wherever, negotiations, fundraising, whatever the case. It's a beautiful territory. It's often when we're talking to Western agencies, we're translating into conservation objectives because a lot of our support comes from the conservation community. And yet a big part of really what Dasi Koch is about for Hanikotin and Unicitin is just protecting space for them to be who they are in their own territory, to practice their own culture. There's been a litany over the 10 years of reports and outputs and deliverables in this act of translation. And I would say that part of the essential approach that the communities have taken and that leadership have taken is to always be moving things forward simultaneously at the governance negotiation level, at the management planning and stewardship level, and at the level for boots on the ground that makes a difference in community members' experience of how their lives are either changed or not changed by this protected area. So we try to keep culture camps going, language camps, youth and elder knowledge sharing opportunities, gatherings on the land, storytelling. So we'll be writing reports and fundraising in the background, but what matters most, that's the translation, that's the code switching. What matters most is giving space for people to fish and to hunt and to make sure their medicine plants are in good condition and to teach their kids about that. So when we have annual gatherings to celebrate the announcement of this area, even as Tsalkotine are still fighting to get it recognized, fighting to protect it. This is what those gatherings look like, and it feels more authentic than when we're meeting around the table, which we also do. And it's just giving people room, that this initiative is rooted in stories. So this is what I mean by the fact that on the one hand, the code switching, the translation, it happens in a few ways. One is this kind of chain of the Indigenous leads on the project giving direction to people like me. So I'm in a supporting role, so that I can draft a management plan. And that in itself is trying to employ a certain level of Western training to understand and synthesize what community members are saying, reflect it back, use professional, integrity to check and see if it's accurate. And we're all then translating that into sort of land use planning and policies and things like that. But I think the initiative itself is also this sort of translation. It's translating how do we want to relate to our land. People are sort of, some of the interesting things, for instance, is Tsalkotine from the get-go identified this as a process of healing. And the community members didn't distinguish between their own personal healing from trauma, their family's healing, and healing the land. So whether it's from wildfire or from logging, floods. So when we write the management plan, one of the things we're doing is ecological restoration is mixed in with community health and well-being, which is mixed in with the cultural revitalization efforts. And it's very difficult to actually carry that through, because everything we do is siloed into different categories. Even funders tend to be siloed. And so we're lucky to have some good partners who understand that. I'll give you one more example and then move on. A fascinating learning curve for me has been learning about what we could call traditional law. So Tsalkotine used the term Dechen Sediltan, which, if I'm correct, and I hope that I'm not too off base here, it translates to laying down the stick. So it's kind of like saying this is the line in the sand. And, I entered this thinking, okay, well, a good management plan for an Indigenous protected area We'll root it in, we'll have guiding principles, and that's rooted in traditional law. So you can have this, you envision this nice tidy kind of progression from traditional law, guiding principles, management goals, objectives, and then, action plans and implementation and operational plans. And it all seems to string together quite nicely. And when we got into the thick of it together, what emerged is a few things. One was there was a deep learning even in how the principles translated. So in Tsokotin language, the words don't even translate the same way. They translate more to an imperative, to an action. Everything's action based. It's like a process. It's we will do this. This is how we will be on the land. Whereas in English, we tend to say things like respect, water. And in Tsokotin, it'll come across more as we'll do things in a good way. So it's a lot more intentional. And the law, Dechenza Duftan, it doesn't translate into a codified set of rules and regulations. It's a practice-based culture. It's about people understanding how to behave when they are out on the land. And so we're having to figure out, how do we represent that in a management plan that asserts the Indigenous law and legal order, but that doesn't falsely try to turn it into a set of rules. And it's something, and the way that we're doing that is ensuring that as messy as it is, ensuring that the work itself is being conducted in Tsokotan language by Tsokotan people, not, I'll play a supporting role, but it's not for someone like me to do first off. It has to come from them. I could talk about that forever, but we're going to move on. So that's a neat way to move into the Unisaitin Quen program, because this is about practice. This is all about practice. So this is a cultural burning fire stewardship program that one of the two communities has begun. The work began in earnest by the community in 2018 in response to the 2017 wildfires. Their community, in that year, that was the year that Williams Lake was evacuated. Their own community was evacuated. It was the largest wildfire in that year in BC. And it catastrophically burned a large portion of their territory. And so one of the many responses that the community took in coming back was to look into revitalizing their own traditional burning practices as a way of healing, and as a way of stewarding that land, partly to restore it and partly to bring it back to a state that would prevent that kind of wildfire in the future. Unisaitin at the time, the chief was former chief Russell Myers Ross. He's still the lead on that program, but it also has broad community support. He's pictured here on the right. And it was also supported by Gathering Voices Society, an NGO, who helped coordinate. And they brought in the gentleman on the left here, Victor Stephenson from Australia, who has supported that kind of work in a number of Australian communities. It's still going on. They burn every spring and every fall and are constantly on a learning curve. I was brought in to support with wildlife management, or excuse me, wildlife monitoring. So people in the community wanted to be able to monitor a number of outcomes as the program was progressing and growing. And one of those is to understand how are animals responding to the burning as they do it. You'll notice, there's a number of ways in which I think this program is quite unique. I would say it subverts a lot of what has sometimes been done by other agencies as prescribed burning, by being very community-based and by prioritizing community relationships with the land. Everything else is secondary. Our monitoring is secondary, fuel mitigation, attempts at sort of how many hectares we're covering, all of that is secondary. And what matters most is people getting out and practicing on the land, learning new techniques. You'll notice they're lighting fire with aspen bark and managing the edges of the burns with fir boughs, starting to learn how to look at the land for different indicators of when and where to burn, touching the soil to feel the moisture barrier that day, looking at the landscape and the snow line to decide how and where and when to light. And I hope to show you a bit of video about this program after I've spoken, so that you can hear and see people's voices for themselves. But I will say that, it also has the approach that Uniciteen have taken as prioritizing, women and men together, children, elders speaking the language. So the tone struck is quite peaceful, even though the goals are big. It's a practice-based approach to doing the work. So this is an example of that. And the research, my job then again is almost one of translation. It's to try to understand that, and then to help our partners. So for the wildlife monitoring, we're partnering with UBC. We have the forestry department and the Wildco lab doing camera monitoring for wildlife. It sounds sort of almost trite, but simple things like, how do you design a sample methodology when you don't know where people are going to burn? Because you have to make sure that you're prioritizing the community's needs first. They will make the decisions in the way that they're learning to practice that relationship with the land. And so the students are figuring out, well, what does that mean when I can't have sort of a control area and I can't have a nice measurable treated, non-treated area to try to draw conclusions? And where do we establish the camera grid in a way that respects people's fishing areas and desire for privacy around the community? So a lot of that translation is happening, but it's what makes it exciting when you have a program that is really being operated that way, and all the work we're doing is in service of it. You can see there's also, children getting the school kids out, elders sharing the medicines, and everything's about supporting how that land is understood and seen. These are some of the images that we like to. The first year with the cameras as well was not just about data collection, it was actually for community engagement. So putting together presentations for the community to get, people get really excited about all the animals that show up in the land. And I will just say before I kind of move on that I think it's one of the things that currently keeps me most grounded. I usually take a couple of weeks every spring. I'm self-employed, and so I get to do that without having to answer to anybody else for the clock. But I take a couple of weeks off and just go volunteer and work with the community. And it's, to the extent this is practice-based and embodied, it's not my territory, but I need to go out there and do it with the community members when they invite me to, because I don't know how to put this into words, but it needs to be somewhat embodied for me in order for me to do my job properly. And so I need to feel all the things that I feel when doing that work. And that's how I build the relationships with the community members as well. So I guess that just to kind of, I was thinking, like, what are the 3 ways I would land these examples? I think that it's, just thinking of the Indigenous-led initiatives I work for are practice-based. They're not data-based. They're not regulatory-based. And so we're always trying to translate an action, a verb, an experience into the codified formats that Western society requires in order to protect space for those communities to just do what they're trying to do. I would say that it's relational. I first went to this region and met Haniko'in. This is my 19th year. So 19 years ago, I was a grad student. And I learned from them. They were patient with me, and I work for them now. And it's never a free ride. You still always have to sort of earn that relationship, and it can be messy. It's like when something's that long term, I make mistakes. There are, people are patient. But you stick around and you kind of commit to the long term. And so for me, that has worked. For me, I've worked with many other communities over the years, but I've found that my preference personally is to be deep in terms of working in one place with a limited number of communities, and to go broad in the sense that I do whatever's required. And that brings me to the third thing of professional agility. It's interesting, even in the sort of 20 years that I've been doing this, that I would say that my role professionally, playing a supporting role, has shifted with the context. So initially it was a student, and those were kind of the days where, you would go and work with a community, but you were kind of just trying to have integrity in how you entered, but really you're doing your own project. And you check in with people, and you have sort of verification processes and everything. And then it progressed. I was into, 10 years ago, I was working for a consulting company, and it was we were cutting edge at the time, and that we would hire community members as co-researchers and offer training if we wanted, but it was still as a consultant doing a discrete project. So we had complete responsibility, but also control kind of the work that we did. And maybe a report or a deliverable would be the outcome. That was the end of the contract. And then you could choose whether to renew. And there's still a role for that sometimes. But now I would say I'm self-employed. And literally, I use the word agile because I feel like I'm hopping and dancing sometimes to provide capacity support wherever it's needed. It's not always glamorous. Sometimes I'm doing to be honest, fairly junior admin tasks because that's what needs doing. And other times I'm leveraging and stretching myself with every bit of experience and training that I have to try to grow into a new piece of maybe governance negotiations that I've never been involved in before, or methodologically trying to solve a problem that we're all working with together. But it requires agility, and to me that keeps it interesting. You just can't have too much of an ego about it. So I'm going to offer very quickly some closing thoughts, and then check in with our hosts to see if we do have time for a couple of minutes of video. But I think I was thinking about, how do you kind of sum all of this stuff up? And I think that I'm hoping it just resonates with a lot of you who are, listening today. And the funny thing that sprang to mind and came up in a conversation with a colleague was that this work actually just requires emotional intelligence too. And one of the things that I always kind of laugh about is, the relationship counseling that I went through when a relationship was going bad probably served me better in my job than it did in my home life, in that learning how to listen and mirror and pay attention, and the facilitation training that I've had. Those are the skills that I find I'm drawing on, when a meeting gets crunchy and gnarly and people are pissed at each other, or something like that. it's how you engage in relationship with other people and with a place that is what carries all the technical methods and everything else. That's just details. Those are just the nuts and the bolts. But the integrity of the work actually comes, I would say, from emotionally understanding that. And the idea of code switching helps me to do that. So I'm going to check in with Haley and see if we have time to share a video. And in that case, bear with me because there's a little bit of technical dancing here. It will be clips. Forgive me. All right, I'm going to interrupt this and show you the beginning and the end.
My relationship with fire is one that is spiritual and renewal. I've been working on collaborating with Gathering Voices Society in doing fire management on Unis 18 caretaker area.
Gathering Voices Society has been supporting the fire stewardship work of Unis 18 and Huntingwood since 2017.
We'll make a lineup right here and we'll start it, and then the fire will sort of move this way with the wind.
It's gonna get hotter out here, eh?
Yeah.
This spring in 2022, we burnt some of the largest areas to date.
Trying to assemble the team. My intention was to have a balanced crew, both of men and women. I'm consciously trying to displace the idea that this is men's work.
Russ was telling me a little bit about what the burning was for and how it's going to help the environment. I guess that kind of interested me.
We can walk on the land together and converse with people and see where their values are at and be able to share and pass down knowledge or learn from each other.
Okay.
To be scared of fire, actually. Growing up, yeah. Like even to light fire in the stove, I was scared of it. So now it's like different, lighting it. It's to watch it burn and clean. It's like a healer, right?
I think it's a beautiful chance for them to reconnect in their own way. Being present on the land has its own calmness, and I think people are, I think they find it healing to be out here, peaceful.
But if you listen now, what do you hear, You hear the wind and the trees, the sound of the fire. Peaceful. That's all part of the ingredients. Peace. And that's what the land enjoys, that memory, that old memory of fire.
You're helping the land and you're helping the future generation, like your kids and your grandkids.
And nice for you or your children, where kids are born in a world seeing people walking through the land, lighting fires, that are real gentle, just looking after country. Now the kids, they can say, in 2023, 5-year-old witnessing the family walking up around the community, burning around the community. That's a big achievement already, like there. And that's such an important thing because that's that passing down of knowledge through generations that needs to come back rather than only just being stories before. And that wasn't long ago, where it was just a story. Well, now they're burning free again and they're not getting put in jail. And the kids are seeing it. And it's about culture, it's about putting the fire back on the country, it's about caring for the land. So it's just really good to see.
1, 2, 3. Hey-o.
Safe travels home.
Yeah, thank you. We'll see you next time, man. Yeah.
All right. Sorry to cut that short. But there's some links in the chat. Gathering Voices Society's Vimeo page has loads of videos you could watch. Those are just a couple of little excerpts. And it's a really nice way to kind of connect. We really wanted to be able to have my colleagues' voices themselves here and present in some way. And so that's how we chose to do it. So thank you. And I'm going to pass back to Haley, and maybe I'll pull that other slide back up. Or to Marcy.
Yeah, yep, coming over to me. Jonaki, that was an amazing presentation, so heartfelt, and I really love that you brought the video in as well, because it really gives us a great sense of what's happening on the ground. And yeah, so thank you very much, and introducing the concept of code switching, which is so important, and the reminder of professional agility for all of us. So there's a couple of questions, and I encourage folks to put anything that you've been wondering about or thinking about during Jonaki's presentation into the Q&A, please, not the chat. And so speaking of code switching, you know, there's a comment here about it being really an interesting concept and taking practice and self-awareness. And I'm wondering if you've got any techniques around that you have found for yourself. You've mentioned listening, but I wonder if there's other things you can sort of talk about to help make that shift yourself.
Yeah, it's interesting. I find I've learned it mostly through observing others and then making mistakes. So, for example, my very first foray into these two communities, it actually was, I was introduced by a gentleman who's a mentor, and he had a long relationship with the communities. And I was, you know, I was trained in ethnography, which actually has its roots in a fairly colonial, you know, practice of sort of categorizing and labeling other cultures. But I think that a lot of the techniques can actually be used in service of Indigenous initiatives. And one of them is just to really be watchful and observant of how people are interacting, literally body language. So when you're looking at how the pace, you get a feel for, it's almost like listening to music. You get a feel for the pace of speech, a feel for whether people are like, you know, right up assertive. Some of the cultures that when I first went to coastal BC, I was with Hilsuk, it was much more like forward and kind of who are you and what are you here to do and how is your work going to help us. Like it was very straight up face on. When I work with Tsilhqot'in, it's also a warrior culture and very strong, but people are much more likely to come and stand beside you or facing the same way and to kind of be more quiet. And I learned early on that, you know, if people maybe won't say no to your face, they just won't show up, and that's your no.
Yeah.
So I think it's being observant. I've also found professionally recognizing how people speak. So in an academic context, we need to talk about these projects in an almost promotional way. The currency is how many publications do you have? What kind of qualifications do you have? The letters after your name. When I go into community, it's when was I last here? Did I know your auntie? When was I last out hiking on the land? So paying attention to what people care about, and how to convey the meaning that is most important in that environment.
So here's a two-part one. So someone's wondering about the protected statutes of the land and how agreements with the BC government were created.
Good question. And the answer is, to date, they have not been. So this is still part of the negotiation and part of the ongoing work that Tsilhqot'in are doing. So they announced Dasiko just on their own terms, on their own territory back in 2014. And there's been, to date, the discussions with BC have happened primarily in their case through the framework agreements that followed title. and also that followed the Environmental Assessment Act rejections of the new Prosperity mine. There was a copper and gold mine. So where they had existing framework agreements guiding negotiations and how those government to government talks would be undertaken, they've brought Dasico to the table in those contexts. But we are still pushing to get recognition. And so right now there is not an overlapping jurisdictional recognition of Dasico yet.
And then here's a question about what ideas you might have about linking land-based programs to folks that are in community who may not be directly involved right now.
Like to people, yeah, to people in community. I'm just trying to make sure I understand the question right. To people in community who aren't involved, I'll maybe speak to both. I mean, there's gradual outreach within the communities to try to make sure, for instance, in Takotan people who are not living in community, I think part of it is about holding events in Williams Lake, in Vancouver, to try to reach the other Takotan people who are not involved. But then the other piece, if I flip that question and interpret it to mean maybe people who aren't involved, who are outside of the community and don't have a good feel for that land-based program, that is a tricky one. I think that communications and gatherings and newsletters and videos like this are actually really key, because one of the things we've found is people need space to engage on the land without feeling watched and observed all the time. And so we're, even like with the Quen program, we're now at a point where we need to give, for the first week, the community just are going to go out and do their thing this spring, without grad students, without me, without the camera crew, maybe, just so they can kind of have room to learn and be without too much pressure of kind of other people wanting to be involved. So it's a little bit of a dance, I think, of protecting space for people to just go and do it, but then doing outreach within the community to draw more people in, and then comms, like a communications plan. We have, we do an update on a communications plan for Dasico every few years, to try to think, how are we communicating about what this work is to a broader audience. Hopefully that answered that question.
Yeah, and there's a related one that has to do with small communities that might have very little capacity, and who just sort of want you to come in and help them do the work, and how to bring your ideas and experience, knowing that there's little capacity within small populations.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree. And I wish we had a lot longer to discuss that one, because in some cases that is the case. So Yunus 18, for instance, is about 400 people on reserve. There's maybe 250, I want to say. And so over the years, capacity within the community to engage in or do any of this has fluctuated. And so, yeah, in a supporting role, sometimes I would totally agree. People just want you to come and get the thing done. And I've certainly found that I've had to actually help coach grad students on this sometimes, that Indigenous led does not mean that those of us who are non-Indigenous sit around waiting to be told what to do. It's actually quite a skilled thing quite often. And this is where that ethnographic kind of facilitation training comes in for me. That's what helps me. It's actually going out there, having the scoping meeting, whatever it is, with the people who have asked you to do something, doing the best you can to spend time out there and figure out what people want. And then taking I'm going to use the word leadership, but taking the initiative to go away, synthesize all of that, and come up with a suggested course of action. And then just check back in and say, all right, from what I heard, this is what I think the next steps are and what I should do. Does that sound all right with you? And then it's the check-in that keeps it Indigenous led. So people, it might be one person who has a 1 hour meeting with you, and they'll tell you if you're off. They'll be like, no, don't do that, do this instead. But 9 times out of 10, when there's a limited capacity, they'll just kind of say, sounds great. Awesome. Like, call me when you're done. And so it takes checking in with them, but just the independence to synthesize what that connection, that relationship with the community into a course of action, and then just go do it. That's what I've found. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, we could talk all morning, all afternoon about this. But I think I need to turn this back over to Haley because there's some closing comments. But Jonaki, I'm wondering if we're able to continue. There's still a few more questions if after we say a few things, and those who need to leave on the hour, they can leave. But are you here for maybe a couple more minutes, couple more questions?
I'd be delighted. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right. Well, Haley, over to you, and then we'll come back to Jonaki with a few more questions after that.
Okay, sounds good. I don't want to do these logistical things right now. I just want to get back into this conversation. We, of course, are at a time where we need to thank Jonaki for doing this with us. Thank you very much. Thank you also to the community members you're working with for providing you with the green light to share this story with us and the insight. Thank you also to the sponsors who have made this whole series possible. Thanks from me to KCP for this continued partnership that results in a really fabulous webinar series. What I want to do next is, and you know what, one more thank you to everybody else who's been following along and asking such really fabulous questions and encouraging us to continue with this series. So thanks everybody. We of course want to know what you thought of the series, and we want to know what you think we should do next. And we want to gather any feedback from you that you'd like to share with the presenters if you haven't already done that. There is a survey link in the chat, and that would be a great way to provide your feedback there. And that's the little nugget of information we wanted to make sure we shared with everybody before we ended the series. We'll email out that survey link, and then we'll also email out reminders on how to access the recordings to all of these fantastic talks. So that's it from me. We can pass it back. We can go right back into that Q&A if we like.
Okay, great. Well, again, thanks to everyone who's joined us today and throughout this whole series. As Haley said, it's been some great learning, and we've had some great presenters, and of course, all of you as participants really help make it feel like it's more of a community out there. So there's you sort of spoke to this a bit, Jonaki, but we could pick up this thread again of someone who's a professional forester and has found it challenging to be sort of flexible in practices and wondering how to go into and sort of be involved in an Indigenous community and be able to practice, and some of the challenges of being invited and getting a door open. And you've talked a bit about it, but just if you have any thoughts to give some of these folks who are coming in with, sort of expertise and skills and just wondering how to do that, the entry, and do it appropriately.
Oh, I mean, it's such an active, alive question, and I fear I may not have an answer that's any that's much use, because I'm sure that whatever I say you've already heard and thought of, and it really does depend on context. It depends on where you live and on what the communities you're around or seeking to enter are dealing with and going through, and how they work. So it's hard to generalize. I mean, I think you touched on it even in the framing of the question. It helps to have an introduction. If there's somebody that you meet or know who has been working with those communities and would like to introduce you or invite you in. Also, you know, if you're approaching communities and you have an interest, I think it helps to just enter socially and show up relationally before it's about the work. And often, I don't know, in the regions where I work, most communities have, especially in the summer times, they have, you know, gatherings and events on the land, and kind of like, I don't know, in Chilcotin it's very horse-based culture. So there's gymkhanas and rodeos and things like that. But there's things where you can show up and just chat with people and learn about what's important to them. I've sometimes encountered situations where people show up in community and they already kind of have an agenda. And one of the things I was told personally right out of the gates when I was a young student, and it was my first trip to the Chilcotin, was, and forgive, you know, I'm going to use the term, but this is what the way it was framed. I was told, when a white person shows up at our door out here, they're either going to try to take something away or tell us how to do something better. And that stuck with me. It's 20 years later, and I'm still measuring how I enter a community by, am I doing that? Am I doing either of those things? And trying not to. And so even when one has the best of intentions, it sometimes may or may not be the right time for them. But hopefully, you know, recognizing the integrity behind the question, hopefully there might be a shared interest or an issue that you have in common, that can kind of bring you together. And I just feel like showing up in person is always the way to go. You'll find out soon enough whether it's the right time or not. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if you can speak to this question or not, but there, you know, of course, are always threats on the landscape. And just there's someone wondering about, you know, what will happen in terms of reviving the Fish Lake, or so-called prosperity mine, and in terms of, you know, the impacts on that, on Sacred Place, and the overall community and territory. Is that something you could speak to?
I can tell you how little I can speak to it.
Okay,
So,
I was
yeah,
wondering.
so the Fish Lake and New Prosperity Mine, you bang on. Though that is at the heart of Dasi Coast. So Dasi Coast was kind of born out of that battle to save that area, and it remains geographically at the heart of Dasi Coast, and also in many ways sort of spiritually. I can't speak a lot to the details, but basically since 2019, after, so the mine went through 2 rounds of Canadian environmental assessment. It was rejected twice under a conservative government, which speaks to the dedication the community showed in fighting it, and then went into a period of about 5 years until 2019 of kind of court injunction battles. And at that point, when it was pulled, the courts finally said, get to the negotiating table. They began what they called the standstill negotiations between BC, Taseko Mines Limited, and the Chilcotin National Government. And I can say that those have been going on behind closed doors for a long time to try to reach some resolution for Taltambi, for Fish Lake. But I don't have a lot of detail on the outcomes of, you know, what the outcome of that will be. I think everybody's hoping it will be somewhat soon, but I'm not privy to a lot of that.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you so much. You've been here an extra 5 minutes and gotten in some more questions, and just really, really appreciate your time and sharing of all your wisdom, and thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone who was listening.
Okay. Bye, everybody.